treacherous sound in the ancient world. Picture yourself standing in the smoldering wreckage of what used to be your village. The bronze plate strapped to your arm is split down the middle, worthless. Your king is on his knees, forehead pressed into the dirt. You exhale. Your shoulders finally drop. You convince yourself the nightmare has ended. You believe surviving the clash of spears earned you the right to keep breathing. That is the precise moment the Roman centurions began to grin. The blood seeping into the soil was never the end of the war. It was the entry ticket. To the legions marching under the eagle, a beaten enemy stopped being a person. You became inventory. The Roman war machine did not feed on rage or the chaos of combat. It ran on a cold, surgical arithmetic of suffering. They did not simply want your territory. They wanted to harvest your sorrow and turn it into a weapon. They intended to peel away your identity layer by layer, stretching your pain into a public exhibition. Your prolonged torment was meant to broadcast a single message to every other nation considering rebellion against Rome. What unfolded after surrender shatters anything a modern mind can absorb. From the carefully staged spectacle of the triumphal processions to a deliberate erasure that scrubbed entire peoples off the surface of the earth, Rome built a machine of domination. Death was no longer the sentence. Death became the mercy you would beg for on your knees. Welcome to the Roman architecture of terror. Once you were dragged into its mechanism, only one door led out. And you will not recognize the creature you must become to find it. Before we walk into the darkness together, drop in the comments the city and country you are watching from right now. Take a second to subscribe and support the project. The dust drifting across the battlefield carried two distinct flavors: the metallic tang of opened veins and the burnt mineral sting of broken bronze. The Roman heavy infantry pulled back in disciplined steps. Their short swords dripped. Their lungs rose and fell in perfect, measured rhythm. The slaughter portion of the day had concluded. The harvest portion was about to commence. If you happened to be a barbarian fighter sprawled in the wet earth, your kneecap shattered into pieces, you might watch the legionaries reform their lines and feel a fragile rush of relief flood your chest. You had survived the meat grinder. Surely the worst was behind you now. You could not have been more mistaken. The soldiers were not standing down. They were stepping aside to make room for the bookkeepers. From behind the Roman formations emerged a different breed of man entirely. No armor, no helmets, clean wool tunics. They carried wax tablets pressed against their forearms and styluses tucked behind their ears. Coiled in their fists hung lengths of black iron chain. These were the mangones, the professional slave dealers of the Roman world. They followed the legions across every campaign, the way vultures track a wounded caravan. But unlike vultures, they had zero interest in the corpses. Their business was the survivors. They moved among the wounded with the bored, calculating gaze of livestock buyers wandering a cattle market. This is the engine almost no schoolbook teaches you about. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, did not wage war purely for honor or expansion or the glory of consuls. War was a corporate operation. The product being extracted, sorted, and shipped was human meat. The merchants worked at a quick professional pace. They performed instant triage on the wounded. If a man had a punctured stomach or a stump where his arm used to be, the Mangone simply tilted his head toward a nearby auxiliary soldier. A short, clean push of a blade into the throat finished the conversation. This was not mercy. It was accounting. A dying captive could never survive the march back to the Italian markets. A dying captive consumed bread and water that produced no return. He was a liability on the ledger. Only the young, the muscular, the resilient were permitted to keep breathing. Once the inventory had been selected, the dismantling of the human being began with industrial precision. Survivors were stripped completely naked, right there in the open field. Their family armor, forged by their grandfathers, was thrown into smelting piles to be melted into Roman ingots. The torques that marked their nobility, the rings that announced their tribe, the leather amulets their mothers had pressed into their hands as boys, all of it was ripped away and dropped into wooden crates. The wind hit their bare skin. They were no longer Gauls, no longer Carthaginians, no longer Greeks. They were rows of numbers on a wax tablet. Iron collars were hammered around their throats, sealed with thick rivets that only a blacksmith's tools could ever undo. From those collars ran heavier chains, linking 20 or 30 men together in single file. The ergastula, the chained columns of human cargo, were assembled right there in the smoking ruins of the villages they had been born in. The scale of this enterprise is almost impossible to hold in your mind. Look at what Julius Caesar did to Gaul between 58 BC and 50 BC. Caesar did not simply defeat the Gallic confederations, he liquidated them. 8 years of campaigning produced numbers that read like a corporate quarterly report from hell. Roman records boast that 1 million Gauls were cut down in combat. Another full million were dragged away in chains. Stop for a moment and try to actually picture that figure. 1 million human beings, naked, collared, roped together, marched across an entire continent. The logistics required to move an unwilling population of that magnitude required a level of cold organization that borders on the psychopathic. Rome did not waste wagons on captives. Rome did not pitch warm camps for them. The chained lines were force-marched through alpine passes, through freezing rain, through ankle-deep mud that turned every step into agony. If a captive collapsed and could not be lifted back to his feet, no one unlocked his collar. The men chained to him in front and behind simply continued walking, dragging his body through the dirt until the friction killed him. Only then would a guard step in with a sword and separate the head from the corpse, freeing the body from the line. The headless remains were left in the ditch for whatever animals happened to find them first. The flood of Gallic captives became so enormous that it broke the Mediterranean economy. Caesar dumped so much human inventory into the markets that the price of a single slave collapsed below the price of a clay jug of cheap wine. A man's entire life and lineage was now worth less than a meal. This was not a bug in the Roman system. This was the system. The aqueducts that still stand in postcards today, the marble forums, the silver coins that paid the legions, all of it was financed by the muscle of men who had once ruled their own valleys. But physical chains alone were not enough. A captured warrior remains a warrior inside his skull. If he holds on to his pride, he becomes a time bomb. He waits. He counts the guards. One night, he wraps his iron chain around a sleeping centurion's neck and dies, smiling. Rome understood this danger with absolute clarity. They had spent centuries thinking about it. They concluded that they had to dismantle the operating system inside the captive's mind before they could safely deploy the body. They engineered specific ceremonies built for exactly this purpose. Rituals designed to execute a man's identity while his heart kept beating. The most notorious of these was the subjugum, the passage under the yoke. This ritual was not invented in a vacuum. It was born from a Roman wound that never fully healed. In 321 BC, an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass at the Caudine Forks. The Samnites forced the captured legionaries to crawl, one by one, beneath a low arch of crossed spears. That humiliation burned itself into the Roman bloodstream. For generations, Mothers in Rome whispered the name of that valley to terrify disobedient children. And when Rome finally rose to absolute dominance, they did not bury the ritual. They industrialized it. After a city fell, the surviving fighters were herded into an open clearing. Roman engineers cut 3 wooden spears. 2 were rammed vertically into the soil. A third was lashed horizontally across the top, joining them. The crossbar was tied deliberately low, so low that no man, no matter how short, could pass beneath it standing. So low that even bending forward would not get you through. To cross to the other side, the defeated warrior had no choice. He had to drop. He had to flatten himself onto his belly. He had to crawl through the mud like an animal. Imagine, for a moment, that you are the chieftain of your tribe. You have spent your entire life sculpting yourself into a vessel of strength. Your skin is mapped with the inked records of every man you have killed. Children in your village hide behind their mothers when you walk past. Your warriors look at you and see something close to a god. Now you stand naked in front of a crude wooden frame in a foreign field. Your wrists are bleeding. Your kingdom is ash. Roman soldiers line both sides of the path you must crawl through. They are not holding weapons in attack positions. They are leaning on their oval shields. Some are eating. Some are chewing pieces of dried meat. They laugh as you approach. They point. They make jokes you cannot understand in a language that already feels like the language of your new owner. They do not see you as dangerous anymore. And that absence of fear, that bored amusement on their faces, is the cruelest part of the entire ceremony. You sink to your knees. You press your palms into the cold mud. You crawl. The actual physical movement takes perhaps 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in those handful of seconds, every layer of pride your ancestors stacked inside your spine for 10 generations is methodically peeled away and burned. You enter the yoke as a king. You stand up on the other side as livestock. And the worst part is that your own mind agrees with the transformation. Because the body acted it out, the soul accepts the verdict. Rome understood something dark about human psychology that modern psychiatry only began to write about in the 20th century. They understood that if you force a man to physically rehearse his own degradation, his interior collapses to match the choreography. You become what you have just performed. Once the mind had been hollowed out, the cargo could be transported safely. The long, freezing marches ended at the great auction platforms of Capua, of Delos, of Rome itself. These markets were assaults on every sense at once. The smell of urine, sweat, animal dung, perfumed oils, and rancid food blended into a single overpowering wall. The noise never stopped. Buyers shouted across the floor. Auctioneers screamed prices. Children of the captured screamed for mothers they would never see again. The captives were forced up onto a raised wooden platform called the catasta. The platform rotated. It was deliberately engineered to spin, so that buyers below could examine every angle of the body without bothering to walk around it. You were not a person on the catasta. You were a side of beef on a slowly turning hook. The paperwork around all of this was meticulous to the point of obsession. Captives shipped in from overseas had their feet dusted white with chalk. These were called the cribati. The chalk announced foreign origin. If a merchant was selling a slave with no warranty for health, no guarantee for temperament, no promise that the captive would not try to escape or kill the new master in his sleep, the merchant placed a small felt cap, called a pileus, on top of the slave's head. The cap was a legal disclaimer. Buy this one at your own risk. The buyers themselves were not the cartoon thugs movies like to portray. They were estate managers in clean togas. wealthy patricians with sons studying philosophy, mining company foremen with quotas to fill. They approached the rotating platform with the same calm, evaluating gaze a modern executive uses to compare quarterly reports. They prodded the captives. They pinched biceps and forearms to test for muscle density. They forced jaws open with their thumbs to inspect for missing teeth and gum rot, because bad teeth meant the slave would die of fever within a year. They stared deep into the captive's eyes, searching for one specific thing. Any leftover spark of defiance, any flicker of the warrior who used to live there. If they found that flicker, the price dropped immediately. Nobody on Roman soil wanted to pay full market value for a future rebellion. To make sure no piece of property ever truly went missing, Rome equipped the iron collars with small bronze identification tags. These tags have been pulled out of the European dirt by modern archaeologists by the hundreds. The inscriptions on them are unbearable to read once you understand what they mean. A standard tag read, "Tene me ne fugiam, et revoca me ad dominum meum." Hold me so I do not flee, and return me to my master. The tag included the master's name, the street, the estate, the city. You wore your own subjugation hanging against your collarbone. The metal was freezing in winter and burning in summer. The edges chafed your skin until calluses formed. The tag was not just a label. It was a permanent, physical sentence carved into your daily existence. Every breath you drew, every drink of water you swallowed, the tag tapped lightly against your chest as a reminder. Your life belonged to a name carved on metal. This is the foundation almost nobody wants to look at. The marble temples that tourists photograph today, the famous philosophical schools, the brilliant engineering of the aqueducts, and the roads, all of it was financed by this relentless, grinding industrial mill of human suffering. The history books like to sanitize it. They show you the polished statues and quote the elegant speeches in the Senate. They walk you quickly past the dried blood under the auction platforms. But the truth is that history is built on these exact hidden mechanisms. The marble is always sitting on top of the iron, and we refuse to look away from the iron. We dig through the cleaned-up records to find the rust beneath the polish. If you want history without the perfume, without the apologies, without the gentle edits, you belong inside the lineage. The lineage is the channel membership club. By joining, you are not simply tossing a coin into a digital jar. You are stepping into the inner ring. You become part of the team that keeps these investigations alive at the highest possible production quality. You get early access to archives. You get exclusive deep dives into the corners of history almost no one is brave enough to touch. Click the join button below the video and take your seat among the few who refuse to flinch. The sorting that happened on the rotating platform decided the precise flavor of hell waiting on the other side of the sale. The strong men with no education, no useful skills, were bought in bulk by agricultural corporations and shipped to the massive latifundia estates, chained to plows under a sun that boiled the brain inside the skull. The truly unlucky ones were purchased by the mining consortiums. If you had been a common foot soldier in a tribal army, your destination was almost certainly the silver mines of Iberia. There, you would be lowered into the dark on a rope. You would breathe in toxic mineral dust until your lungs filled with crystalline scar tissue. You would die, on average, within months. You would never see the open sky again. Your bones would become part of the mountain. But Rome played by a completely different rulebook when it came to the elite. If you were a king, if you were a general, if you were the man who had dared to organize the resistance against the legions in the first place, Rome did something far more terrifying than killing you. Rome kept you alive. They fed you carefully. They tended your wounds, not because they pitied you, because they had built a stage for you in the capital. And the show they were about to put on with your body had been rehearsed for centuries. The blackness underneath the Capitoline Hill was the kind of blackness that has weight. It was wet. It pressed against the skin like a second body. If you had been unlucky enough to be defeated by Rome, and unlucky enough to carry royal blood in your veins, the chains and the long march were never the final destination. You were transported to the very center of the known world and dropped into a stone shaft called the carcer. There you sat, for weeks, for months, sometimes for years. You listened to the slow drip of water working its way down through the arched ceiling. You counted the drops, because counting was the only mathematics left available to you. And you waited, not for a trial, not for a verdict. There would be no judge. You were waiting for one specific date on the Roman calendar. You were waiting for the triumph. The Roman triumph is almost always described as a parade in textbooks. That is a lie of omission so large it deserves its own confession. The triumph was not a celebration. It was a precision instrument of psychological annihilation, dressed in flowers and trumpets. It was the day the Roman state turned the suffering of a human being into entertainment for the masses, the way a modern city turns a stadium event into a televised broadcast. When the morning of the procession finally arrived, the iron doors of the carcer were dragged open. The captive king, who had not seen sunlight in months, was hauled up the stone steps into the open air. The light alone was a form of torture. His eyes, which had adapted to absolute darkness, could not handle the assault. Tears poured down his face. The crowd would later interpret those tears as weeping in defeat. They had nothing to do with defeat. They were a simple, physical reaction. But Rome did not care about the truth of those tears. Rome only cared about how they looked from the bleachers. The sensory overload hit the captive before he could even adjust. Rome on the day of a triumph was an avalanche of noise. Hundreds of thousands of citizens packed against the route. The air was thick with the perfume of burning incense, deliberately lit to mask the underlying stench of sweat, manure, and human terror. At the head of the procession rolled the victorious general, the triumphator. He stood inside a towering chariot, pulled by 4 white horses. His face was painted bright red, deliberately styled to mirror the terracotta features of the ancient statues of Jupiter. For this single day, the Roman state permitted a flesh and blood man to dress up as a living god. But every god requires sacrifices. Every god requires an audience to confirm his supremacy. That was the function of the captives. They were arranged directly in front of the divine chariot. They were the physical proof that the man behind them had achieved godhood. Rome understood the theater of pain at a level of sophistication that would make a modern stage director jealous. They did not simply parade the defeated kings in iron chains. Iron was beneath them. Iron was for common slaves, for farm hands, for mining stock. For royalty, Rome commissioned chains forged from solid gold. At first glance, this sounds almost like a perverse honor. It was not. It was a meticulously calculated form of physical agony. Gold is one of the densest metals on Earth. A heavy gold chain wrapping the wrists, looping around the neck, and binding the ankles weighed nearly 3 times what the same length of iron would have weighed. The defeated king was forced to march through the winding streets of the capital, carrying close to 50 pounds of soft metal across his shoulders, neck, and forearms. The gold, being soft, bit deeply into his skin with every step. The weight forced his back into a permanent curve. He could not stand upright, even if his pride begged him to. The chains physically choreographed his submission for the crowd. He arrived as a king and was geometrically reduced into a hunched, broken silhouette before he had even taken 30 steps. The route was engineered to be punishingly long. It snaked through the Circus Maximus, brushed past the Palatine Hill, and crawled inch by inch along the Via Sacra toward the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus at the summit. The crowds along the way performed their assigned role with enthusiasm. They screamed obscenities. They hurled rotten produce. They spat. Some of them stepped forward to slap the captive across the face before being pushed back by the centurions. The king walked through this corridor of pure, manufactured hatred. But the real cruelty was not the spit or the rotting figs. The real cruelty walked beside him. Rome forced the king's family to march in the procession alongside him. His queen, his brothers, his sisters, his infant children, sometimes still nursing infants. They were dressed in their traditional royal garments, now torn, stained, soaked in sweat. The king had to listen, with his eyes pinned forward, as his own children cried in confusion at the screaming Roman crowd. He knew what was coming at the end of the road. He had heard the stories. And Rome wanted him to know. Rome wanted him to feel every step. They weaponized his love for his bloodline, transforming his role as a father and a husband into his deepest possible wound. The man who could endure a sword to the stomach without flinching would crumble at the sound of his child's frightened voice. When the chariot finally reached the steep climb up the Capitoline Hill, the entire procession came to a halt. The moment of culmination had arrived. The triumphator turned his chariot toward the temple to perform sacrifices to Jupiter, and at that exact instant, the captive leader was pulled away from the route, pulled out of the procession entirely, dragged sideways down a narrow alley. He was being escorted to the Tullianum. The Tullianum was the lowest chamber of the prison system, a circular pit, accessible only through a hole carved in the ceiling. There were no stairs. There was no door. The executioners pushed the captive toward the opening in the floor of the upper chamber. They shoved him through. He fell 12 feet down into a damp, lightless stone room that smelled of mildew and old blood. There was no grand executioner's block. There was no platform. There was no last speech, no final words allowed to ring out for the historians to record. The executioner climbed down a ladder after him. In the absolute pitch black of that pit, he wrapped a simple length of rope around the captive's neck, and he pulled. The king of a sovereign nation was strangled in what was essentially a sewer. Once the body went limp and the heart stopped, the executioner climbed back up the ladder and signaled the guards above. A young messenger then sprinted up the hill to the temple. Only then, with that confirmation received, did the general slaughter the white bulls dedicated to Jupiter. The order was sacred and immovable. The blood of the human enemy had to flow first. Only after that could the blood of the beast follow. After the ceremony, the king's corpse was hooked through the jaw with an iron meat hook and dragged across the stone streets, down through the city, and thrown into the muddy current of the Tiber River. No tomb, no grave marker, no memory, not even a name carved into a wall. The Roman state had ensured that even the soil refused to remember him. But Rome's machinery of terror was not exclusively pointed outward at foreigners. A system built on absolute domination requires absolute obedience from its own enforcers. The Roman legionary was the most lethal heavy infantryman of the ancient world, and the reason had almost nothing to do with how much he hated the enemies in front of him. He was lethal because he feared his own commander far more than any barbarian sword. When a Roman unit broke ranks, retreated without authorization, or attempted mutiny, The punishment Rome reached for was specifically engineered to shatter the soul of the legion from the inside out. It was called decimation. The word has been emptied out by the modern era. People today use the word to describe a bad sports loss or a difficult quarter at work. In the Roman army, decimatio meant something exact and surgical. It meant the removal of 1 out of every 10. If a cohort of 500 soldiers showed cowardice in battle, they were marched outside the camp walls in disgrace. They were stripped of their armor, stripped of their weapons, stripped down in some cases to their tunics, sometimes even further. The commander ordered them to form ranks in the open dirt. Then the men were divided into groups of 10. And here is the part that most history teachers gloss over. These were not random men thrown together. The Roman army was organized around a tent group system called the contubernium. These 10 men shared a single leather tent every night. They ate from the same iron pot. They marched shoulder to shoulder. They had stood next to each other in battle for years. They knew the names of each other's wives. They knew which one snored. They knew which one prayed to which god before a fight. An officer approached each group of 10, carrying a polished bronze helmet. Inside the helmet, 10 stones, 9 of them white. One of them, somewhere in the bottom of the pile, black. The soldiers reached in one by one without looking. The man whose fingers closed around the black stone was marked for death. And here is where the genuine darkness of Roman military discipline reveals its full shape. The commander did not order the Praetorian Guard to step in and execute the condemned soldier. He did not call upon professional executioners. He gave the order to the other 9 men in the tent group. 9 men who had pulled white stones were each handed a heavy wooden club called a fustis. They were ordered to form a tight circle around their tent mate, their friend, their brother in everything but blood. If any of them refused, all 10 of them would be executed instead. The choice was engineered to have no exit. The men raised their clubs. They brought the wood down on the head of the man they had shared bread with the previous evening. They cracked his collarbone. They caved in his ribs. They broke his jaw. They beat him until his skull was no longer recognizable as a human head. They beat him until the body in the center of the circle finally stopped twitching against the dirt. Rome forced its own soldiers to bludgeon their closest friends to death with their own hands. And the survivors were not given relief afterward. They were not embraced. They were punished too. They were rationed raw barley instead of the wheat the rest of the legion received. Barley was animal feed. The message was unmissable. They were ordered to sleep outside the fortified walls of the camp, exposed to night cold, enemy raiders, wolves. Rome understood something profound and terrifying about the human nervous system. Physical pain fades, bruises heal, bones knit back together. But the psychological scar of beating your closest brother to death with a wooden club never closes. It rewires you. It guarantees that for the rest of your life, you will never disobey another order. You become an instrument that the state can play. When Rome needed to broadcast a message that transcended military discipline and struck directly at the civilian populace, at the slave classes, at any subject who might dream of rebellion, they reached for the cross. Crucifixion was the highest, most refined expression of Roman cruelty. It was a punishment reserved exclusively for the lowest classes. Slaves, pirates, enemies of the state, foreign rebels. It was considered so degrading, so beneath human dignity, that Roman citizens were legally protected from it, no matter what crime they had committed. A citizen could be a serial murderer and still be granted a relatively quick beheading. The cross was beneath him. The purpose of crucifixion was never just to kill. Killing was easy. Rome had 100 faster methods. The purpose of crucifixion was to maximize the duration of conscious agony while keeping the victim alert enough to suffer every second of it. The anatomy of the cross was a masterpiece of biological sabotage. The victim was stripped completely naked first. Naked because humiliation was part of the design. They were thrown flat on their back across the horizontal beam, called the patibulum. The executioner took a square iron nail, roughly 7 inches in length. He did not drive that nail through the palm of the hand, the way Renaissance painters loved to depict. Nails through the palm tear out under body weight. The flesh between the fingers and the wrist simply cannot hold the load of a hanging human being. The executioner knew this. He drove the nail through the wrist instead, between the radius and the carpal bones, in the channel where the median nerve runs. That placement was not accidental. It crushed the median nerve at the moment of impact. The shockwave of pain that traveled up the arm and exploded into the chest was unlike any pain a human being can describe. Survivors of partial crucifixion in later centuries described it as liquid fire pouring into the bones. Then the victim was hoisted up onto the vertical post, called the stipes. The feet were positioned one over the other, or sometimes placed side by side against a small wooden block, called a serpentium. A single nail was driven through the heel bones, and then the body was allowed to drop. Gravity took over. As the body hung downward from the wrists, the pectoral muscles across the chest locked into a contracted position. In this configuration, the human respiratory system enters a nightmare state. You can inhale. You cannot exhale. Carbon dioxide begins to build up in the blood. To force the air out of the lungs, the victim has to push up on the nail driven through the heel bones. He has to drive his own torn, whipped back against the splintered surface of the upright post and lift his body weight. With each push, he exhales. He gulps in another breath. Then he collapses back down because his legs cannot hold him. Then the suffocation begins again. He pushes up again. This horrific respiratory dance, this slow back and forth between drowning in his own carbon dioxide and tearing his back open against the wood, could continue for days. 3 days was common. Some victims, in cooler weather, lasted close to a week. There are documented cases of soldiers being assigned to watch a single cross for so long that they had to be rotated out. In 71 BC, the gladiator Spartacus led a massive slave revolt that genuinely terrified the Roman Republic to its core. When Marcus Licinius Crassus finally crushed the uprising, he did not simply want to claim victory. Crassus wanted to make absolutely certain that no slave anywhere in Roman territory would ever look a free citizen in the eye again. He took 6,000 surviving rebels from Spartacus's army. He ordered them marched to the Via Appia, the great paved highway that connected the city of Rome to the city of Capua. Crassus ordered the construction of 6,000 crosses. He had them lined up along the side of the road. For 130 miles, the most famous highway in the empire was transformed into a corridor of rotting flesh. A traveler walking that road did not just see the warning. They heard it. They smelled it from miles away. 6,000 men hung in the air, each one pushing up on his nailed heel bones to drag a single breath into his lungs. The collective groaning carried on the wind. Crows came in by the thousands. They did not even wait for the men to finish dying. They landed on the cross beams while the victims were still conscious and pecked at their eyes because the men no longer had the strength left to swing their arms in defense. Wild dogs gathered at the base of every cross, sitting patiently like trained hounds, waiting for the blood that dripped down the wood. The smell traveled for days. Anyone walking from Rome to Capua, or from Capua to Rome, carried that smell home with them. The lesson had been broadcast on a scale that no public announcement could ever rival. And that was exactly the point. This was the architecture of an empire, a system constructed, foundation to roof, on the public display of extreme, deliberately engineered violence. And the records of this cruelty were not left to legend or rumor. They were meticulously documented at the time. The primary source for the anatomical and structural realities of these Roman punishments is a text you can access right now. Look at your screen. Click the View Products button. The book featured there is a monumental archive of terror. It is the spine of today's story, and you need to hold a copy in your hands to truly understand the depth of what we are uncovering. You will also see a carefully curated selection of additional themed artifacts displayed alongside the book. Open the shelf. Explore what other immersive pieces and dark memorabilia are waiting to complete your collection. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Secure your piece of history and browse the relics while we descend further into the dark. Rome had stripped them of their freedom. Rome had taken their families. Rome had crushed their bodies against the wood. But even as a man hung gasping on a cross, even as his lungs filled with carbon dioxide, he still owned two things. He still owned his name. He still owned his gods. So Rome built a weapon designed to take those two. Sau potentinens, Claude respondu. The endurance of human flesh is a closed equation. The endurance of human flesh is a closed equation. The body can absorb a finite quantity of pain before the nervous system trips its breakers, shuts down, and grants death as a final escape hatch. The engineers of the Roman war machine identified this ceiling very early in their imperial career. They understood that if they wanted dominance that stretched across centuries, they needed to break out of the prison of the physical. They needed to learn how to attack things that could not bleed. They needed to figure out how to assassinate an idea. Long before a Roman siege engine launched its first stone block against a city wall,